Much of Israel's history and much of the Old Testament involves men called prophets. Now, a prophet was a person chosen and commissioned by God to do two things, both of which involved getting God's message out to the people. A handy way to visualize this is to think of priests speaking to God on behalf of the people, and prophets speaking to the people on behalf of God. There were two types of messages from God delivered through the prophets. One happened when God revealed some future event to the prophet, and he delivered that message to the people. This is probably the way we usually think of prophets, telling the future. And some of these prophecies are absolutely amazing, telling specifics about people and events hundreds of years before they happened. We might note that people who don't believe in God or in the supernatural try to explain away these predictions by claiming that they're actually written after the event occurred, but the evidence is strongly to the contrary. So that's one thing a prophet does for God, predicting the future events with the goal that their message will give people hope or confidence or a warning. And that takes us to the second kind of message that the prophets gave. Not foretelling the future, but forthtelling. Telling forth a message from God about what was happening right then. Usually these messages told the Jews that God was displeased about something going on in their nation. And let's face it, there was a lot for God to be rightly upset about. The books of the prophets in the Old Testament are divided into two sections. The longer books are called major prophets: Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Daniel. The other 12 shorter books are called minor prophets: Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. Each book is named after the prophet who wrote it or the prophet the book tells us about. So roughly the last third of the Old Testament is these 16 prophetic books. A couple of the books are pretty much accounts of the life of the prophet and a record of the message that he gave. One great one is Jonah, which tells about Jonah's running from God, being swallowed by a huge fish, and then giving God's message and warning not to Israel, but to the pagan city of Nineveh. Another prophetic book that tells us mostly about the life of the prophet is Hosea. He was told by God to marry a prostitute who later left their marriage and returned to her prostitution and ended up being sold as a slave. God told Hosea to buy her back and to take her again as his wife. And then God says this as his message to Israel: though you have played the harlot with other gods, I still love you and want to bring you back to me. Being a prophet was not much fun. Since the Jews often didn't like the prophet's message, they blamed the messenger. Prophets were arrested, beaten, exiled, sometimes killed. Jeremiah tells God that he hates being a prophet and he's not going to do it anymore. But when he tries to stop, he says God's message burns in him like a fire and he can't hold it inside. As with Jonah, sometimes the prophet's message is not for Israel, but for the nations that surrounded them and often abused them, nations like Egypt. Two of the common themes in the prophetic books are religious hypocrisy and idolatry, and often the theme is social injustice and abuse of the poor and the needy. You can see how these themes would resonate in 21st century America, where we live in an increasingly secular society with an increasing difference between the haves and the have-nots. So reading the prophets can be pretty depressing, but pretty interesting too. They show an often detailed snapshot of life in ancient Israel, how they conducted their business, what their customs and lifestyles were like, and most importantly, the consequences for a nation moving farther and farther from God. If you want to try reading one of the prophets, you might try Daniel. It's not long, but it includes some forthtelling of future events, some amazing stories from Daniel's olden life, and some warnings from God for people then and now.